There comes a moment in an empath's life that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally it marks a permanent shift. It's not loud. It's not emotional. It's quiet, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but for the empath, it's the day something finally clicks. It's the day they realize that words, no matter how carefully chosen, no longer have the power to fix what was never truly being heard. Empaths are by nature translators of emotion. They don't clear throat, just feel deeply. They process, analyze, and then attempt to communicate those feelings in a way that creates clarity and connection. They explain because they care. They explain because they assume that if someone could just understand their perspective, everything would settle into place. Misunderstandings would dissolve, conflict would soften, relationships would stabilize. But over time, a pattern begins to emerge. They start to notice that their explanations aren't creating understanding, they're creating cycles. The same conversations repeat. The same points are made again and again with slightly different wording, slightly more effort, slightly more emotional investment. And yet, the outcome remains unchanged. They are still being misinterpreted, still being dismissed, still being seen through a lens that doesn't match who they actually are. This is where the psychological fatigue begins to build. Because explaining isn't just talking, it's emotional labor. It requires the empath to revisit their feelings, organize them, soften them, and present them in a way that won't trigger the other person. It's a constant act of self-editing. And when that effort isn't met with genuine understanding, it doesn't just feel frustrating, it feels invalidating. At first, the empath responds by trying harder. They refine their language. They become more patient. They give more context, more examples, more chances. But eventually, a deeper awareness starts to form. They begin to question not their ability to explain, but the willingness of the other person to understand. And that's a critical distinction because there's a difference between someone who can't understand you and someone who won't. One is a limitation, the other is a choice. When an empath recognizes that they are dealing with the latter, something shifts internally. They stop seeing communication as the solution. They start seeing it as a loop, one that keeps them emotionally invested in a dynamic that isn't evolving. This is the breaking point. Not an explosion of emotion, but the absence of it. They begin to feel the weight of every past explanation, every moment they tried to be understood, every time they gave someone the benefit of the doubt. And instead of motivating them to keep going, it does the opposite. It creates clarity. A kind of clarity that is almost uncomfortable at first because it forces them to confront a simple truth. Not everyone is meant to understand them. And more importantly, not everyone is trying to. This realization doesn't make them cold. It makes them precise. They stop over-explaining not because they no longer care, but because they start valuing their energy differently. They recognize that explanation, when given to the wrong audience, becomes self-abandonment. It's an attempt to earn understanding from someone who has already decided not to give it. So, they pause. They listen more than they speak. They observe more than they react. And in that space, they begin to see things they couldn't see before, patterns of behavior, subtle dismissals, inconsistencies between words and actions. Things that were once hidden behind their own effort to make it work now become obvious. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is the moment where the empath's relationship with communication fundamentally changes. They no longer feel responsible for being understood by everyone. They no longer believe that clarity is something they can force through explanation. Instead, they begin to understand that true connection doesn't require constant translation. It requires mutual willingness. And where that willingness is absent, silence becomes more honest than words. Because at a certain level of awareness, you realize something most people never fully grasp. If someone repeatedly misunderstands you after you've made yourself clear, it's not a communication issue, it's a perception choice. And no amount of explaining can override a decision someone has already made about who you are. Once an empath reaches that breaking point where explaining no longer feels effective, the next shift is even more profound and far less visible from the outside. It's the movement away from seeking validation and towards something far more stable, self-trust. For most of their lives, empaths operate with an unspoken assumption that understanding must be mutual to be real. If they feel something deeply, but no one else acknowledges it, they begin to question it. Not consciously at first, but subtly. They look for confirmation. They explain not just to be heard, but to be validated, to have someone else say, yes, that makes sense. Yes, your feelings are justified. And on the surface, that seems reasonable. Human beings are wired for connection. We calibrate our reality through feedback. But here's where it becomes psychologically complex, because when someone is consistently surrounded by people who dismiss, minimize, or reinterpret their experiences, that feedback loop becomes distorted. The empath starts outsourcing their internal authority. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" they begin asking, "Is what I feel acceptable?" Instead of trusting their instincts, they look for approval. And over time, this creates a subtle but powerful form of self-doubt. Not because they lack insight, but because they've been conditioned to question it. This is why over-explaining becomes a pattern. It's not just about clarity, it's about reassurance. It's an attempt to stabilize their internal world by aligning it with someone else's agreement. But once the empath stops explaining, something unexpected happens. At first, there's discomfort, even anxiety, because without that external feedback, they're left alone with their own perceptions. And if they've spent years relying on others to confirm those perceptions, this silence can feel disorienting, almost like stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. But then, gradually, something begins to recalibrate. They start noticing that their initial instincts were often accurate, that the feelings they tried so hard to justify didn't actually need justification, they needed acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement doesn't have to come from outside. This is where self-trust begins to rebuild. Not as a sudden surge of confidence, but as a quiet, consistent recognition of patterns. They remember the times they sensed something was often were right. The moments they felt disrespected, but talked themselves out of it. The situations where their intuition was clear, but they overrode it in favor of maintaining harmony. And once those patterns become visible, it changes the way they interpret their own experiences. They stop negotiating with their instincts. They stop explaining their boundaries as if they need permission to have them. They stop diluting their emotional responses to make them more palatable for others. And most importantly, they stop equating disagreement with invalidation. Because one of the most liberating realizations an empath can have is this: someone else not agreeing with you does not make you wrong. It simply means they are operating from a different framework, one that may or may not have the capacity to fully understand yours. This is where emotional intelligence evolves into something more grounded. It's no longer about reading the room and adjusting accordingly. It's about reading yourself and respecting what you find. The empath begins to shift from "how do I make this make sense" to them to "does this make sense to me?" That question changes everything, because now their decisions are no longer filtered through the need for approval. They're filtered through alignment, through internal consistency, through a sense of personal integrity that doesn't require constant external reinforcement. And ironically, this is where their communication becomes more effective, not because they're explaining more, but because they're explaining less. Their words carry more weight, more precision, because they're no longer trying to convince. They're simply stating. There's no excess, no emotional overextension, just clarity. And clarity, when it comes from self-trust, doesn't need to be repeated. At this stage, the empath is no longer trying to win understanding. They're discerning where understanding already exists and where it doesn't. And that discernment allows them to invest their energy more strategically, more intentionally, and with far less emotional cost. Because they've learned something most people spend a lifetime avoiding. When you trust yourself, you no longer need everyone else to. What follows this shift into self-trust is often misunderstood by the outside world, and even at first by the empath themselves. Because when an empath stops explaining and stops seeking validation, what naturally replaces those behaviors is silence. And silence, in most social dynamics, is misinterpreted. People assume silence means weakness, avoidance, emotional withdrawal. They think something is wrong, or that the empath has lost their ability to communicate. But what's actually happening is far more calculated, far more intentional, and far more powerful than anything that came before it. Because this silence isn't passive, it's selective. Before the empath spoke to create connection, now they withhold words to preserve clarity. That's a completely different psychological position. One is outward focused, constantly adapting to the emotional temperature of others. The other is internally anchored, guided by discernment rather than impulse. And this is where emotional intelligence reaches a higher level of expression. You see, most people associate communication with speaking. But at a deeper level, communication is about control, control of timing, of delivery, of presence. And silence, when used deliberately, is one of the most precise forms of control available. When an empath begins to understand this, they stop reacting immediately. They stop filling every gap in conversation. They stop correcting every misunderstanding in real time. Instead, they pause. They observe. They allow space to exist without rushing to resolve it. And that space does something very revealing. It exposes people. Without constant explanation to guide the narrative, others are left to reveal their assumptions, their intentions, and their level of awareness. You begin to see who seeks to understand and who simply seeks to be right. You notice who becomes curious in your silence and who becomes uncomfortable. And that distinction tells you everything you need to know. Because when you remove your effort from the equation, the dynamic becomes honest. This is why silence is so often misread. It forces people to confront what they were previously avoiding. When the empath is no longer over-explaining, no longer softening every edge, no longer managing the emotional experience of others, there's nothing left to hide behind. And for some people, that's unsettling. They may try to provoke a reaction. They may push for explanations that the empath no longer feels compelled to give. They may interpret the silence as distance or even rejection. But what they're really encountering is a boundary, one that doesn't need to be announced to be effective. Because true boundaries are not always spoken, they're demonstrated. And silence is one of the clearest demonstrations there is. It says without words, I see what's happening and I'm choosing not to engage with it. It communicates awareness without confrontation, strength without aggression. It removes the emotional fuel that certain dynamics rely on to continue. And once that fuel is gone, those dynamics either transform or collapse. Now, this doesn't mean the empath stops communicating altogether. It means they become precise about when and how they communicate. Their words are no longer used to manage other people's perceptions. They're used